Today we return with episode 2 of our journey into Japji Ji Sahib. With Dr. Jvala Singh, we continue with 8 key questions that move between Ernest Trump's colonial lens and Saib Singh's grammar-led approach. Is Gurbani something to be fixed by grammar or felt through poetry? Do colonial translations still shape Sikh thought, or have they been left behind? And can multiple interpretations of Japji Ji Sahib coexist, or must one frame take precedence? This episode takes you deeper into Japji Ji Sahib, where colonial translations and Sikh scholarship meet, clash, and continue to shape how Gurbani is understood today.
So Trump sets the tone and sets basically the discussion, that he sets the boundaries of the discourse that arise now when thinking through Gurbani and translating Japji Ji Sahib and the other compositions in Gurbani. For example, and this is pretty well established in the academic literature, Mandair writes about this quite a lot. And he talks about how after the translation of Trump, after his translation, what you have a lot of the works that come after that are basically in response to what Trump was saying, right? And Trump was saying a couple of things. Number one, that Sikhism, as presented through Gurbani, is not monotheistic. It doesn't have a one God. For example, the way he translates ik om God, he kind of totally ignores the ik, and he just puts om there. And that's significant as we're going to look as kind of what ik means in the pre-colonial text, and we'll touch on that later. But a lot of the response then that comes after is kind of responding to Trump and basically agreeing to the terms of the discussion, in that he wants to present Sikhism as being, this is how he's writing it, as being, Trump is saying that pantheistic, that they believe in many different gods. So a lot of the times when you have writers coming after Trump, they're trying to present this opposing view, right? They're trying to counter what Trump is saying. Basically, what ends up happening is not that the next set of translations from, let's say, Saib Singh or Veer Singh or even Farid Kortika, it's not that they are, you can't derive benefit from reading them. It's just that you have to understand that they are in broader conversation with these other texts, for example, Trump's translation. And I think one thing that the course is going to be doing and kind of teaching students is to look at some of these texts in relation to the conversations that are taking place, right? So, for example, when you look at Veer Singh's text, he's in conversation with Trump. When you're looking at Santokh Singh's text, Garab, that's going to be in conversation with Anandgan. And there's interesting conversations that arise in both of those conversations. For example, in Santokh Singh's text, Garab, he's responding to a question that Anandgan Digodasi has about who is the guru, right? And we're going to kind of discuss some key terms like Nam and Karam and these, right, that come up in these types of texts. But it is a very difficult question. How do we understand these terms? And these terms get debated, right, in these commentaries. For example, Guru gets debated, right? Anandgan is saying that Guru Nanak has 6 gurus. He has 6 gurus, right? And we can talk about some, Indic deities, Brahma, Shiv, etc. Whereas Santokh Singh is going to counter that and say, no, you've misunderstood what Guru Nanak is writing. So, just to start this conversation about how are the students going to be looking at Japji Ji Sahib, they're going to be looking at a variety of texts. And what Trump, going back to the point of Trump, is that Trump represents this moment in history where you have this systemic shift. You have this great break from the pre-colonial, right? During this period, you're seeing a moving away from anything related to the Indic, which you can say anything related to the Hindu, right? And that is really going to handicap approaches to understanding Gurbani because it's so intertwined. The mythology, the cultural references, the discussions that are happening between Guru Nanak and the Siddhas, the yogis, Guru Nanak and Vedantins, people that believe in Vedanta and the various types therein, and other devotional groups as well, right? So the course is going to aim to present both the pre-colonial, which itself has variety in it, and then also kind of comparing that with the works of Trump, and afterwards as well, Veer Singh, Saib Singh, etc.
You mentioned that there was obviously a change from the pre-colonial into the colonial, and I guess we're now existing in a post-colonial world to some degree. And discussing some of those terms, and I guess just to give people listening an example, how would some of those terms that you mentioned, like hukum, naam, or gyan, have changed? And in that change of definition, how has that then perhaps impacted wider understandings or like interpretations of Gurbani as a result of defining a key term, perhaps in a way that wasn't intended in the first place?
Well, going back to Trump, as I mentioned, his translation kind of sets the frame, and that frame has to be this Christian frame, right? So that's one problem in that, in terms of defining these terms, the question is, how do you interpret in a pre-colonial period versus after Trump in this colonial period, and even we're going to say like we're in a post-colonial period, but those attitudes to understanding Gurbani remain from that colonial period, and that's what I think the value out of this course is that in this course we are going to look through how people of the pre-colonial period interpreted some of these terms, and I will just say here is that the attitude in the pre-colonial period was more expansive. They were looking at multiple definitions of these terms. So, for example, in Jap Ji Sahib, this is something that's going to come up later on. When you look at Karam Khand, these are multiple realms that are talked about at the end of Japji Sahib. And even that, actually, just to kind of divert a little bit, you have to understand how people are talking about realms in these types of texts. For example, this is a poetic trope. This is an idea that people write about in text from that time period, right? We might read this now and say that, oh, like it's mentioning Karam Khand, this Sach Khand, these are realms, right? These are like places. These are like, it's a desh. This is a region that, if we, let's say, accumulate enough Simran points or Bart points that we get, this travel ticket, we get the, flight to this region. Like, that's not how people are talking about, Khand or realms during this time period, right? And you can see that in the commentary, in the verses, both by Bhai Mani Singh Shahid and Bhai Gurdas. We're going to be using these other texts to kind of look at and how to interpret Gurbani. But for example, let's take the term karam, right? This could mean, from the Sanskrit background, this could mean action, right? Karma, as we kind of say it in the West now. Or this could mean from Farsi, it could mean grace, right? So which way are they going to interpret, this term? You can see that in the commentaries, and a specific attribute of the pre-colonial text is that they look at it in multiple different perspectives, right? And this is something that gets cut out during the colonial period because of, largely, I will say, because of Trump, in that Trump is in discussion with these Nirmala scholars during that time period, and the Nirmala scholars are giving Trump multiple meanings to these texts, and that's not how Trump wants to interpret Gurbani. He wants to say, okay, there's one meaning, uh, and if this meaning is unclear, that's the fault of the text, right? And when he's writing about Gurbani, he says that Gurbani doesn't present a clear one, singular perspective that's congruent across the entire text, right? And I will say the pre-colonial period, that was not the point, right? There are multiple perspectives and multiple truths that have to be held at the same time to understand Gurbani. For example, the truth or the perspective of bhakti or devotional lens, alongside a kind of wisdom-oriented perspective where there's non-duality, right? These multiple perspectives can be held at the same time, and that's what actually interpreters, commentators, and Sikhs in that pre-colonial period were doing. So the course is aiming to, when looking at these terms like hukum, karam, naam, shabad, what do these terms mean in a certain context, in a certain shabad, according to that certain body, that verse? We're going to be looking at the commentaries to dissect that. And one takeaway I think that most people are going to get from the course is that they're going to see how, depending on context, you're going to have different interpretations, right? And these terms are purposefully ambiguous, right? They're purposefully multivalent. They have multiple meanings, right? So that they can, so they're used in a certain way to evoke certain meanings and kind of different perspectives, right? And that is the poetic beauty. That's the poetic expertise of the author of Guru Nanak in that, in these compositions like Japji Sahib.
I just think what's interesting whilst we're talking is obviously you said, and this I don't think is new for anyone who's read Trump's work, but the idea that he argues that the Guru Granth Sahib Ji is just, it doesn't have any philosophical argument that is kind of a connecting thread through all of it is just really interesting because it's interesting for two things. Obviously, it's false because that is not just true, full stop. But secondly, it's actually more accurate to apply that to the Bible because, again, it's contradictory. It's an evolving theology. It's written by loads of people over a huge span of time and space. And also, on top of it, it's been whittled down over various years. So I just find it's almost just kind of like a random kind of just thought. But it's just interesting how that criticism actually isn't applicable, but you turn it around and it kind of sticks. The other question I wanted to ask is when you're talking about Karam, this is more so out of my own interest. What do writers discuss in terms of how it works? So from what you've read and what you've put together for this course, I always recently the debate that I have with my brothers is whether Karam is linear. So does it work in the sense that if I, for argument's sake, slap someone in this life, I'm then going to get slapped up, for argument's sake, just to simplify the argument, in the next life? Or is the slap that is happening that I'm going to give to someone in this life actually like a return of something that happened in a past life? And actually, does it work linearly? Just because I've slapped someone, does that mean that I'm then going to get a slap in return, for argument's sake, right? Does it mean it's going to happen linearly in terms of a time thing? So it will happen in a future life? Like, I know that's philosophically loaded in every way of the term, but what would you answer to that, or how would you kind of go around discussing that idea? Like, how does Golem work?
We are going to discuss this in the course, and I'll kind of give a quick preview here, because when I'm talking about Trump and saying that Trump is saying that Gurbani doesn't present as kind of a clear, congruent philosophy, it's not to say that in the pre-colonial period, you didn't have these questions arise. For example, in Gurbani, you have lines like "Meta nasake koi," that you have this karam, and it cannot be erased by any means, right? Nobody can erase it, right? That if you have a bad karam, you're basically screwed, right? And if you do bad things, it's coming to you, right? Whether in this life or the next life. But at the same time, in other parts of Gurbani, you have the references that through the grace of the Guru, that all your karam gets torn away, right? And if the Guru is, gracious, he will destroy all this type of bad karam, right? These are now two opposing views, right? And these questions come up both in commentaries, texts like Sikh Guatemala, which talk about stories related to the Sikhs. If you are an avid listener of the Suraj podcast, the stories of Guru Hargobind, this comes up where there's a Pandit who's doing katha in the Sangat from a Sanskrit text, from a Purana. And in the Purana, it mentions, okay, after you die, it takes X amount of months for you to get to the next stage in life, where you arrive at the court of Dharmaraja, etc. And as this Pandit is doing katha, there's a couple of Sikhs in the Sangat, they're sitting there and they're listening to this. And one of the Sikhs says, you know what? If Guru does get upon me, it won't take me 9-10 months or however long it takes. It'll take me 6 months to get there. And then another Sikh is listening to this and saying, you know what? Maharaj just get upon me. I'll get there in 3 months. It's really funny because this is almost like you can imagine this happening today. And then another Sikh saying, you know what? Maharaj just get upon. It won't even take me 3 months. It'll take me like 1 day to get there. Instantly I'll get there. Pandit is listening to this. He's like, what the hell are these? I'm sitting here doing katha from this text. And text is saying X amount of months. Now these Sikhs are just saying all this nonsense. He goes to Guru Hargobind and says, your Sikhs in Sangat are basically, making a mockery of this text that I'm doing katha of, right? And saying, with your kripa, you can just, none of this matters, right? And Guru Hargobind says basically, listen, Pandit, like both of these things can be true. That at the same time you have Karam philosophy, and at the same time, if Maharaj is Kripa, all of this can be erased, right? And these two truths can be held at the same time. This is later explained in Suraj Prakash in interesting and kind of creative ways, where they say, well, it is true that you will experience these, let's say, bad karam, the result of that. But what Maharaj will do, what Guru, Arjan Dev Ji, I think it comes up in those stories, they'll happen in your dreams. So, for example, there was a story of this, it was a beggar and a Raja. And I don't want to go into this story in depth, but basically, this person experiences the bad karam in his dream, and Maharaj allows him to kind of wipe the slate clean. It has been experienced, but in a kind of a dreamlike state, and it's through Maharaj Kripa that it all got erased, basically. So there's like creative ways that storytellers and writers are trying to deal with this. But at the end of the day, the commentators, like in Mani Singh's text, the Sikhani Bhagatamala, talk about how at these things are both true at the same time, right? And it's kind of paradoxical that if Maharaj is Kripa, then it is true. And I'll say this again when kind of going back to Karam. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is that in Karam philosophy, you have there's three types of Karam, right? And depending what you do, Sanchit Karam, Kriyaman Karam, Pralabd Karam, these are three types of Karam, right? And essentially, what if you do bad here, right? It gets accumulated, right? And then you will get the result of that, whether in this life or the next life, right? But then you say, okay, well, Gurbani says at other points that we don't even really exist, right? Like, who is gonna hold this accumulated karam if all of this is an illusion? For example, okay, I die, my body perishes. What goes to the next life, right? In Karam philosophy, what goes into the next life is what's called your sukham sarir, your kind of subtle body. Now, it's not the physical body, but it is a set of your senses, your mind faculty, your chit, etc. All of these, and that kind of travels to the afterlife, right? And that actually holds then your accumulated karam. But at the same time, Gurbani says, nothing comes and nothing goes. And then this sense of self that you have, that, I am Jvala Singh, you are Amar Singh, this is all just, illusionary, that your parents have given you this name, your Panch Bihari have given you this name. You have this continuity of memory, and that kind of builds up this association that I am like this compared to other people. And then you have to build up this kind of fake persona, right? And that is what you kind of associate with the self, right? As I am like this. That's, Gurbani says over and over again, that that's not going to go with you, that's not real, right? So how do you interpret those two things, right? In the commentaries, and this is something we're going to get to, because Gurbani, Japji Sahib specifically in the course, we're going to be talking about Karam, right? It says in Japji Sahib that, what you do, you will, get the reward of that, right? And how do you make sense of that when it says, with the Karam of Paramatma or the Guru, that all of it can be wiped out? We're going to be reading how commentators talk about that and kind of hold those two truths at the same time. And, that is purposeful. And that is not, I would say, a fault of the text. If anything, it kind of describes the beauty of the text, that you can kind of hold these two truths at the same time. And this is, uh, you know, if you want to think about it, because if we're born here in the West, we're naturally going to have an inclination towards Western science and all this. And kind of from a kind of a quantum physics perspective, the nature of reality can be paradoxical depending on how you look at certain things. In the same way, is bhakti an ultimate truth? Is Gyan an ultimate truth? Or are these perspectives that lead oneself to kind of an ultimate reality, moksha, liberation, anand, whatever you want to call it, right? So I think when you look at the pre-colonial text, you're going to see a level of complexity that kind of gets flattened, I would say, in the colonial
Yeah.
period, because they only want to present just one perspective.
On that as well, and this is again more my personal curiosity than anything else, but a debate that I think is always really interesting, or question, is how does Karam and Hukam work together? And I guess you kind of just touched on it in terms of, while Karam is actually that you are stuck with your Karam, and Hukam is actually the grace of the Guru in terms of being able to alter that radically in whichever way is deemed like appropriate. How do pre-colonial text and the text that you used discuss that concept in particular? And do they say anything in particular in terms of the relationship between those two, or is it similar to what we've just been discussing?
It's very similar to what we've been discussing in the first couple of Podian, the verses of Japji Sahib. We have this discussion about hukam and what that means and how we have to hold that idea and what's actionable about that idea. Meaning, okay, one thing I really want to stress in this course is that the way Gurbani is talking about these ideas, it's not writing it like to say that, okay, this is a metaphysical truth. And yeah, you should just know this truth. What it's saying is that, okay, this is an idea, this is a perspective you need to hold in your head because it shapes how you act. It shapes your interaction with the world, right? When it says these ideas, when Guru Nanak Dev Ji is writing about hukam, there's instruction there as well that, okay, you have to understand everything as preordained. That is kind of uh, whatever is going to happen, and that is something that you should take on with a smile, right? That you should actually prasanta, like with happiness, with raji, with anand. You are gonna, walk through this kind of predestined, kind of ordained reality, right? But it's giving you instruction there as well. It's saying like, okay, how to face that. This is not a nihilistic way of thinking about the world that, oh, everybody's screwed. It's like, no, you have to understand that whatever's going to happen at the end of the day is going to happen, and that you should kind of take it on with grace and gratitude and, happiness, right? And at the same time, that's not an excuse because those things are kind of paired to action in an honorable and a virtuous way, right? So like Karam, when Karam gets talked about alongside Hukam, Guru Nanak Dev Ji is instructing that, and this is an aspect that I find really frustrating in not only modern Sikh kind of commentaries, but just the online discourse, or let's say like the discourse generally across kind of let's say Sikhi, is that over and over and over again, you get this when speaking about Gadam, this stress, this emphasis on virtuous action, right? Accumulating, cultivating guna, qualities, good virtues, right? Sata santoka deyataram, like truthfulness, compassion, empathy, forgiveness. These are talked about over and over and over again, right? In Gurbani. And yet somehow they get ignored because it's much easier to just think about, okay, I need to accumulate as many recitations of Japji Sahib or Nam Jap, etc. And it's not to say that that aspect is not talked about or it's not stressed. It's just that when it comes to the hard work, it's very easy to kind of ignore those aspects of it, right? Um, but that is tied specifically to the idea of Karam, right? And I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, Vin Gun Kite Pagas Nahoy, that basically without accumulating, this is in Japji said, without accumulating good qualities, virtuous action, you can't even be devotional, right? It's kind of a prerequisite that you should have that kind of, you have to orient yourself, you have to kind of purify the vessel before, you start putting these other elements in it as well, right? For consumption. So these elements about hukam and karam are paired together in the first few podia, and that's actually going to be covered in module number 2 in the course.
One of the what is the word? One of the commentaries that you discussed earlier was one by Saib Singh. Now, what is in particularly special about his approach, and what is it also about his understanding that perhaps risks narrowing the meaning down a little bit too much? I guess a caveat to that is I'm assuming actually his response, as we've been discussing kind of over the bridge of both episodes, is he's responding to Trump. So actually, he risks narrowing himself down by engaging in the conversation rather than just kind of rebutting it completely. But what is going on there? What is Saib Singh doing? What does his commentary bring to the table? And what are those risks associated?
So what Saib Singh does, for those who don't know, Saib Singh is kind of the first who writes an extensive grammar of Guru Granth Sahib. He writes his grammar of Gurbani, and his Tika, his commentary, is pursuant to this grammar that he's kind of reverse engineered, in a sense. Like he's looking at Gurbani and he's trying to kind of say that, okay, if there's an onkur here, if there's kind of a line underneath a word, if there's a sahari, these are just, grammatical elements that you can interpret Gurbani in a certain way. And I would say he didn't invent, this idea about looking at Gurbani grammatically. Um, in his reverse engineering, he is drawing from a previous tradition. Like, he didn't invent that tradition. And we know this because you have texts like Santokh Singh where he's mentioning some of these aspects of Gurbani that, okay, if you have, for example, onkar at the end of the word in a specific context that's singular, if you have it, hahinu sahari, this is plural, bahuvachan, etc. You have these elements, right, that get talked about in the pre-colonial period in these commentaries. The difference with Saib Singh is that he's saying, okay, there is a grammar, and I'm only going to interpret Gurbani through this grammar, right? And that grammar is applicable across Guru Granth Sahib, which is interesting because Guru Granth Sahib is multilingual. There's many different languages in Gurbani, right? And there's a limitation to that grammar that I think he even acknowledges that, in some aspects, the grammar changes, right? There's different rules for different sections of the grammar, whether it's Farsi, the Sans, Sanskrit sloks, etc. Like there's different elements there. So what he tries to do is he tries to just say, okay, there's one definition based on these rules of grammar, which I am kind of outlining. And I think to understand it, you have to look at the contrast. Other schools of thought are saying, look, it's not that grammar. And actually, if you look at the modern discourse from the Sampradaya perspective nowadays, let's say, who are the main proponents of this? You can say Damdam Tiksal is the main proponent of it, to say that grammar is just, that's a stupid approach, right? And when they're saying that, I think there's a misunderstanding. It's not that those elements don't exist, because, the greats from that lineage, Sant Guru Bachan Singh, writes about, for example, even in Katha, he talks about, okay, if there's, this element, well, it's going to represent this grammatical case. They do use grammar, but they don't limit the interpretation to that. So, for example, Sahib Singh presents one meaning of a certain word or a certain phrase of Gurbani. In the Samprada, in kind of these traditional learning institutions, these lineages, for example, the Gyanya Bunga out of Amritsar, which comes from money thing, you have all these whatever offshoots from that. Dam Dam Ituksa, you can talk about other lineages like Nirmale and Udasis. They present multiple different interpretations for not only a certain word, but multiple, like the whole line as well, different interpretations. And that's a much more kind of expansive way of looking at Gurbani, because they're also knowledgeable about the different perspectives throughout the entire text, right? And they can think through more holistically, okay, what are the multiple meanings that the author is trying to convey? And that, I think, is really important, because poetry, a good poet naturally creates ambiguity. Like that is the sign of a good poet, and not just ambiguity that is unintelligible, like that is just meaningless, that is just confusing, that you're doing because you're an idiot of a poet, right? You have no idea what you're doing, and you're just throwing paint at the wall. But poets who are very knowledgeable about the discourses with other texts, the intertextuality is what they'll call it if they're kind of responding to, let's say, like yogic text or, Advaita texts or other devotional texts, and also intratextuality, meaning within, this is what Guru Arjan Dev Ji does so wonderfully, like Guru Amar Ji, Guru Ram Das Ji as well. They're like responding to other compositions in Gurbani as well. And you can see this because there's sections of, the other gurus, Guru Amar Das Ji, Guru Ram Das, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, where they're kind of like responding to the Mool Mantra or responding to sections in Gurbani through very innovative and unique ways, right? And this is the kind of the beauty of it, and it's like a beautiful way of looking at interpretation. So, for example, when you're looking at a painting, there's multiple ways of interpreting the painting, right? And the painter knows that, right? And the painter is crafting that painting specifically, with these multiple layers, right? And that makes it so beautiful. That makes it. We talked about this before in the previous part of this podcast, where you can listen to it over and over again and take different perspectives from it, and that's the beauty of it, and that is something that I'm really trying to do in this course, and I think that is a unique element of this course in that it answers a question that I think a lot of us growing up in the West have, in that how do we just look at a text like Japji Sahib? What is our entry point? How do we engage with this text? Do we just pick up a translation and we read through it once and say, okay, this is just one interpretation. Let's say, for example, I'm going to have Nikki Gurinder Kaur Singh's translation of Japji Sahib, which I think is really good. Like, it's very poetic. It flows, very beautifully written. Um, but is that it? Like, is that just the one way of interpreting it? How do we study a text like this? Do I just pick up any type of tika? Like, for example, this is Garab Ganjani tika. Do I just pick this up? Do I read that? It's very daunting, this task, right? Because there's so many different tikas, so many commentaries, so many interpretations. You know, um, one benefit I think the students are going to get is, number one, I'm going to be showing them the different commentarial traditions, the different traditions, how they are interpreting this text differently, the presenting different meanings. And at the same time, I'm going to be extracting kind of the main conceptual ideas from Japji Sahib. Like, we talked about Hukam. How was Hukam talked about throughout the entire composition, right? How was Hukam talked about in relation to Karam, right? What are the discussions that Bhai Gurdas is going to write about, that Bhai Mani Singh is going to be writing about, that Santokh Singh is going to be writing about? For example, what about lines like Panch Pradhan, right? Which, is a section in Japji Sahib. Santokh Singh writes, there's so many interpretations for this line. And he says, what I have heard from Gurmukhs, from Sikhs in Amritsar, specifically, he's talking about that Gania Bunga, right? That lineage from Sant Singh to Bhai Mani Singh Shaheed. He's like, I'm writing those down. Like, so you're hearing the conversations that people in the early 19th century were talking about, right? And if you're not able to kind of dissect these texts, translate them, extract kind of the information, the relevant information, because there's a lot of material, like a lot of these commentaries. For example, this one, which I think is just wonderful, Sant Guru Bachchan Singh's Pehli Pothi of Guru Granth Sahib. Um, there's 700-ish pages just for Japji Sahib, right? It's an extraordinary text, right? But there is a lot in there, and it's like, they're really throwing the kitchen sink, at the reader here. It's like, how do you know what's relevant that's going to help you at your stage, like where you're at. And this course is going to be doing multiple things. It's going to be for those people who are just reading Japji Sahib honestly for the first time, so they can extract kind of bird's eye view, kind of the main concepts from it. And it's also going to be relevant to those people who have it memorized, who are reading it every day, who have gone through meanings already, who have kind of taken their, first couple of steps in kind of interpreting Gurbani. Because I'm going to be presenting not only multiple meanings which are taken out of these texts, but also, outside of these texts, what are like the commentaries from Bhai Mani Singh Shaheed, Sikhami Bhagatmala, conceptual arguments, and these types of discussions are all going to be brought up.
So you were mentioning Paisa Toksing and a number of other authors as we were discussing. And I think what's interesting is the framing of Japji Sahib as a commentary itself on the Mool Mantar, and then the Japji Sahib is a commentary on the Mool Mantar, which itself is a commentary on Itkumkar, and then the rest of the Guru Granth comments itself on Japji Sahib. How does that logic then perhaps help us understand the Guru Granth Sahib Ji today as a whole? How does the Japji Sahib build on Mool Mantar? How does the Guru Granth Sahib Ji build upon Japji Sahib? And is that approach the best way to look at it, or does it have its disadvantages? And more importantly, how are pre-colonial authors and the authors that you have read, how do they approach that topic?
Well, I mean, this is an idea that, Guru Granth Sahib can be like all of the, I guess, essential concepts, philosophies, they're all encapsulated within Japji Sahib. And all of those are encapsulated within Mool Mantar. And all of that is encapsulated, Mool meaning kind of the root within the seed, the Bij Mantar meaning, Ik Onkar, right? It's just an expansion from that, right? In many ways, that can be true if you're thinking about like, okay, Japji Sahib does have this vast array of all these different philosophies and ideas that you see in Guru Granth Sahib, right? And I think that is how much of the tradition, the Sikh tradition, has accepted, has kind of viewed Japji Sahib, is that, if you understand Japji Sahib, like this is the key, right? Oftentimes we hear this idea that like, Five Gurdas's Vara are the key to understanding Guru Granth Sahib, right? But at the same time, I think Japji Sahib is really the core text, and it's not that, okay, if you understand Japji Sahib, then you really have no need for the rest of Gurbani. It's like, because then you could say, okay, after Guru Arjan Dev Ji compiled Ad Guru Granth Sahib, was there a need for Guru Tegh Bahadur to write Bani, right? And then you could say, okay, was there a need for Guru Gobind Singh to write his own Granth there as well, right? And this Bani, like, I think is a beautiful way. Even Guru Gobind Singh actually is in conversation with Ad Guru Granth Sahib. You can kind of put those side by side when he's talking about, for example, in Bachitra Natak, and he's talking about all these different, avatars and, prophets, etc., like Muhammad, who has come down. And he's saying they all started their own panth, but they have not understood Satanam, right? That the name is of Paramatma is truth, meaning eternal, right? So there's this play on the term of Satanam there, right? Which goes back to Mool Mantar. But my point of this is to say that Japji Sahib, I think, for the longest time has been considered the kind of gold standard, that if you understand Japji Sahib, you really are able to conceptualize, you're really able to interpret the rest of Gurbani. It's not that, the rest of the Gurbani is just repetition. The rest of Gurbani is building off of those ideas, is in conversation with those ideas, are kind of using and creative, innovative ways of talking about those ideas. For example, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, there's this verse, and actually going back to Mool Mantar, you might read Mool Mantar, and this is actually a kind of something I'm going to be talking about in module number 1. You might read Mool Mantar and say, okay, the arth, the meanings of this is very sukhan, very easy, right? If you interpret it from a very modern point of view, you can say, okay, one God, Ik Onkar, one God, truthful name, or his name is true. He's the creator. You just go on like that, right? Very easy. But within Mool Mantar, and this is coming from the commentary of Bhai Mani Singh Shaheed, all of these very important philosophical ideas about whether Paramatma, whether the divine is Nirgun or Sargun, right? In this discussion of Akal Murt, that's talked about, right? And kind of explain whether, when you talk about Satanam, are these two terms together, or should we understand Sat as different and the Nam is separate? What does Nam mean? If Nam, we mentioned this before really briefly, but if name and form, if the whole world is illusionary, then, isn't name illusionary, right? Like name is not eternal, right? So how is it paired with Sat, meaning eternal, right? Which is true across 3 times, all the aspects of time, past, present, future. So all of these discussions get brought up and explained in Mool Mantar, right? It's just how you are approaching it. And I will say that this is the problem, kind of going back to when you're just opening up a text like Japji Sahib, is how do you read a text like this if you've not been taught properly, right? And this is why I'm going to go back to this question about if Japji Sahib, if it encapsulates all of the Siddhant in a second, but just kind of diverting for one moment. For a student, right, for somebody who just picks up a text like Japji Sahib, how are you to learn this text, right? First of all, not only 100 years ago, probably about 100, 120 years ago, uh, if you picked up a text like Japji Sahib, it was in Ladivad, first of all. It was in kind of a script where it's all together. How are you going to read that if you're not been taught, right? The medium in which we have kind of organized Gurbani requires a teacher, right? And that's at the same time where we say, and this is very much true, that Sikhi has kind of democratized knowledge, right? And this is how people even interpret ik in the Ik Onkar, that's saying everybody, right, falls within this one, right? That there is this kind of non-dual Paramatma Rab, right? And because of that, everybody has adhikar, access to knowledge, right? This is how Farid Kortiga talks about this. This is not just a modern interpretation. Um, everybody has access to Gurbani, knowledge, education, the philosophy of the gurus, right? Whereas previously in many Indic traditions, depending on your caste, depending on your, position in society, you were excluded from these things, right? You had a job and that was to clean and that was it. You're not even going to be able to listen to kind of philosophical truths, right? Whereas this is opposed to the guru's mindset. But at the same time, you have a problem where you do require a teacher, right? When learning, uh, and how are you going to learn a text without a teacher in a modern, uh, time period, right? For us, we don't have a teacher, right? And that teacher has to then be aware of, the previous literature, the pre-colonial literature. I was talking about this is a systemic shift that happens. So you do need access to, what has come before, the discussions that come before. And that is what this course is doing. I'm trying to kind of curate all of this material so that even those who have never studied Japji Sahib before are able now to look at this. And throughout Japji Sahib, you're going to have all of these concepts which are going to be relevant to any aspect of Guru Granth Sahib that you're going to look at, right? And that's why Japji Sahib is so important. So going back to how Japji Sahib encapsulates all of the kind of the Siddhant, the kind of the end goal, the philosophy, the core kind of the meanings, or let's say the multiple perspectives that you have in Gurbani. There's one tradition which many people probably know, Dam Dam Intertextual, and it's kind of Jathadar's head leader, Sant Gurbachan Singh. When he was learning amongst many other students at that time. He was learning under Sant Sundar Singh. And when he was learning, kind of the final test, right? The gold standard to see if this guy was, ready to lead the Jatha, kind of teach the meanings that have passed down from generation to generation. Sant Sundar Singh gave this test to all of his students to say that, okay, I want you all to, in the most concise way, write poetry that explains the meaning of Japji Sahib, right? That you have to now compose however many meters, 40 meters, 39 meters, I forget how long his is, maybe 40 to 60 meters. And you have to explain every aspect of Japji Sahib in that. This is a very interesting task, because most people think of knowledge as somebody that can kind of just talk for hours and hours and hours, right? And that does show a level of competency and kind of knowledge acquisition, that somebody can kind of speak on and kind of retrieve all this knowledge that they learned, and they can go for like 4 or 5 hours. But in the same way, and a kind of an often forgotten way, somebody who in a very concise way can kind of put all the meanings and kind of explain something in just one or two lines. I would say, even a more difficult skill to have, right? That you can be very concise and you can get the meaning across without this extra kind of just fluff, right? Because a lot of people they can speak and they can add fluff and fluff and fluff. So that was the task. Sant Gurbachan Singh writes the meanings of Japji Sahib in about 40 to 60 verses. Um, in poetic meter as well, right? So you have to know how to craft that in poetic meter. If you're interpreting poetics, right? If you're trying to interpret, like Sunya, those podiya are in the chope meter, right? That Guru Nanak Dev Ji is writing in. If you don't know that, right? If you don't know how to kind of craft your own meter, how are you going to interpret poetic meter? So Sant Gurbani Singh writes this. Sant Sundar Singh is like, okay, you got it. You understand the discussions that are happening in Japji Sahib. You can explain the philosophies, the various philosophies. And, it is, you have embodied those meanings if you're able to craft and beautifully articulate it in poetic meter, right? So, and in a very concise way. And that was the test. And Sant Gurbani Singh, because he had that test, it's like, all right, you got it, and you are ready now to lead, this group and kind of continue on, pass down these teachings which have been passed down by generation, right? That text has been translated by Jeevan Singh of UK, and I will be posting that for students, and it'll be on. It's already online, but I will be posting that again just so people have that there. But so that is an idea that that Japji Sahib does contain the kind of the varied philosophies, perspectives in Gurbani.
With your course then, what mindset shift or kind of what are you hoping to achieve with what the student leaves with? Like, as in, not just perhaps in understanding Japji Sahib, but also how they can then perhaps approach other Gurbani. Is the goal simply just to deepen their understanding of Japji Sahib or Gurbani, or is it to kind of provide some type of shift in their understanding that they can then take on further and adapt and apply to other texts?
Number one is that they're gonna be. I think what they will find most interesting is that they're now in conversation with, these people that have lived in the 1800s, 1700s, right? So they're going to be looking at terms that have been used in multiple different ways. For example, the word nam, right? What does nam mean? What does it relate to? We say nam means name. Okay. Well, what does name relate to, right? Why is name important, right? What is that? How does name function as a spiritual practice, right? We're going to talk about bhakti. And then we're also going to talk about, okay, what about gyan perspective through that definition of nam, right? And in these commentaries, it mentions how nam can be split up in a different way, where it says na, so it's a negation, and then the mamminu onkar in the mo means more, means attachment, so it means no attachment, meaning you are kind of separated, you are kind of you have this kind of divine perspective that where you are not attached to anything, and that means kind of alluding to no sense of self, right? Where it's kind of you're in this non-dual perspective, right? So it can represent both things, kind of in a Dvaita, a kind of non-dual perspective, and at the same time, a kind of a devotional perspective, right? And you're going to see how commentaries have been using those two definitions, across, time. So one thing is that you're going to see that there's much more creative ways of looking at interpreting Gurbani. And I will say that while saying that it is important that the students are in conversation with the tradition, right? To learn the text, you do need to learn the text. This is what I was alluding to earlier. How do you read a text that's in Larivad? How do you read a text that you have no idea what the author, who the author is in terms of what are they in conversation with? What are these ideas about hukam? What is the imagery? What are the tropes? How are the metaphors being used, etc.? It's not that you're looking at Gurbani and that you can now just make up whatever artha you want to make up, right? That's not what these Gyanis are doing. These Gyanis from these schools, like the ones out of Amritsar, the kind of heart of the tradition, right? The Gyanya Bunga, what they are doing is they are kind of carrying forward this lineage of Mani Singh onward, right? And in that, they're presenting multiple different meanings, right? So you are in conversation with, these Sikhs from the 1700s, the 1800s, who are grounded in, a tradition that has lineage, back to Mani Singh Shahid, back to Guru Gobind Singh. We are going to be looking at other lineages as well, like the Nirmala tradition, the Udasi tradition, and we're going to see how they differ on some of these points. And not to say that one is invalid or the other is valid. We're not making those types of judgments here. We're just seeing the multiple perspectives here. And I think another thing that people are going to take away is that how Gurbani is using poetics, right? Because when you were reading translation, this is something we talked about earlier, is that we're reading a translation. The translation is in prose, right? The translation is not I mean, Nikki Gurinder Kaur Singh does a really good job making it poetic and beautiful. But nothing is like the original, right? And that's not a mark. That's not a. I'm not insulting her work. I'm including it in this work. I think it's a really great effort. I love it. I always recommend it to students. But I think one thing is that they're going to have a deeper understanding of the poetics, how the poetics are being used, the fundamental concepts throughout a text like Japji Sahib, and it's going to give them a grounding that I think when they look at Gurbani going forward, they're going to have an idea. Uh, they're going to have a way to frame what they're reading, right? They will have an understanding. Okay, here it's talking about Hukam, here it's talking about Karam. Why is it talking about Paramatma in the masculine tense, right? Because this is something that is going to come up as well. Um, is it true that we can just kind of erase all gender from these types of texts, right? How is Guru Nanak writing about it, right? These types of what are those tropes doing when we say that all the devotees are women and Paramatma is like Pati Parameshwar? Like, what is that trope doing, right? How have people written about that, before the colonial period, right? I think that's going to give them like a foundation that they are now going to be able to look at other aspects of Gurbani, other portions of Gurbani, and be able to have a kind of a baseline, a way to interpret it, where they don't get kind of stuck into this, oh, this aspect is not really congruent, so I don't know how to interpret it, so I'm going to ignore it, right? Or for example, why are there certain references here? I'm going to ignore these references. Let's say the Indic references or Islamic references. Like this example of hukam comes from Islamic political, let's say, imagery, right? Where Paramatma, Rab is kind of conceived, kind of fashioned as this divine king, right? And the divine king sends out an order, a hukam, and that is the command, right? But you have to know the imagery to make sense of how, the author is kind of using that in a certain sentence in a specific context.
How does your course ensure that it doesn't just provide, say, perhaps a singular translation from a lineage that is perhaps the most recent or perhaps the most famous? How does it, I guess, balance numerous interpretations from the different sampradayas, but also how does it balance perhaps interpretations within a tradition and how that may have evolved or changed? And also, I guess, whilst we're at it, how does your course then also provide like the historical context for why perhaps some of those interpretations are changing when they are changing or evolving?
That's a brilliant question, actually, because if we're talking about certain traditions, number one, students are going to get an understanding of, okay, what are the different commentarial traditions, right? This is going to come up in module number one. There, we're going to be looking at, okay, like you have modern interpretations, Saib Singh, Veer Singh, Trumpp, etc., and more recent, Nikki Kaur Gurinder Singh. But you're also going to get, okay, we're going to be looking at Udasi commentaries by Anandagan. We have Nirmala ones. And we have from the Ganya school, Santokh Singh. And we're also going to have probably Mani Singh Shahid, right? And we're going to be looking at different, how some of those, let's say from one school of thought, let's look at the Ganya Bunga, how Mani Singh Shahid at times presents a different interpretation from Kavi Santokh Singh's, right? And we're going to think about why. Number one, these texts are not translated. So the course is going to be translating these, presenting them to students as reading materials. And so, the students are going to be accessing this material largely for the first time. There are some people who have, read some of these materials before, but I would imagine a lot of the course is going to have students that have not really looked at these types of materials, right? In looking at the multiple interpretations, we are going to be balancing them, um, and the aim of the course is not to have all of these different materials and say, okay, this is the most correct, right? That is not the approach we're taking. We're taking the approach of what do these interpretations have in common, and where do they disagree? Why would they disagree? And in that, I am going to be talking about the context. So, for example, when it talks about Guru Prasad, with the Guru's grace, who is the guru there, right? I mentioned this a little bit before. Anandagan is going to say that Guru Nanak had, 6 gurus. He took the kind of different deities, Indic deities as the guru. Whereas you're going to have in conversation with Santokh Singh saying, no, that's not true, that he is misinterpreted, and that if he was part of the tradition, and this is really interesting where he's saying that he would know that this is just absolutely nonsense, right? So you have these types of discussions which actually sound very kind of colonial in a sense, but they're actually happening in the pre-colonial period. One thing I wanted to add is that in these texts, what's really fascinating is not only in the commentaries, but in texts. So I'm not only drawing from commentaries, I'm drawing from them, but I'm also drawing from texts like Suraj Prakash, which is more of a historical narration of the 10 gurus, their lives, Bansavali Nama, the Chopa Singh Rayat Nama. I'm like drawing from a variety of texts to see how they talk about Japji Sahib, see how they interpret it. Because not only are we going to be understanding kind of the meanings, we're also placing it in the historical. So what I mean is when, for example, and texts like Pantha Prakash by Ratan Singh Pangu, when we look at certain verses, like Panch Pravan, Panch Pradhan, in the Chopa Singh Retnama, it says that Guru Gobind Singh said that line when he created the Panch Pyare. He said, "You guys are Pravan," right? So we see how like different lines throughout time have relevance to certain situations which we all know. Like for example, he says that to them, saying, "Okay, you guys are Panch Pradhan. You guys are Pradhan. You guys are like the top." Right, and you see the system then carry forward. We have the 5, the beloved ones, administering Amrit, getting together for Gurmatas, etc. And then you also have lines from Suraj Prakash, which talks about how Ram Kaur, who's a Sikh of Guru Gobind Singh, how he is noting to the Sangat that when Guru Gobind Singh was walking into that funeral pyre, he's saying, the such jugad, such happy, such nanak hosi pi. Like, how badass is that? That Guru Gobind Singh is saying, like, truth was in the beginning, truth is throughout the ages, truth is, there will ever be truth, like, talking about what we really are doesn't die in that fire, right? We might think that as we walk into the fire, this is the end of Jvala Singh or Amar Singh. We're saying, no, 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 what is true remains true. It always will remain true, even though like perhaps the form is not true, right? So not only is it situating Japji Sahib in time with the stories of the gurus, how they were referencing, how they were using Japji Sahib, thinking about their own contextual situation, like walking into the funeral pyre saying that. Now every time I read that slok, I think about that and thinking about kind of like the fortitude that Guru Gobind Singh had, right? And also kind of like what he was saying to instruct his Sikhs, like, don't worry, like, you think I'm going, but this is in one sense he had told the Sikhs that I will always remain within the Khalsa, right? And that's from old texts as well. And another perspective, it's saying that, listen, we may think fire destroys, but it doesn't, right? um what is really eternal, odd such God such, that remains eternal forever. So you're kind of situating Japji Sahib. I will be talking about how the gurus use Japji Sahib. So you're kind of situating it in this kind of timeline and with the stories of the gurus. For example, when Guru Tegh Bahadur, this is mentioned in Suraj Prakash, when Guru Tegh Bahadur is just about to obtain Shahidi martyrdom, he sits there in front of the executioner and he recites Japji Sahib. And he says, well, okay, when I finish Japji Sahib and when I bow my head, at that point, Chala, kind of basically strike your vad.
Do your job.
Yeah. And so we're going to hear all of those types of stories as well in the course, right? So it's not just a reading course where we are just going to be reading a text, kind of ignoring the historical context or the historical references, how Japji Sahib gets used throughout time. And at the same time, when we are reading texts like Japji Sahib, you can't read it in isolation. And that's one thing that I hope the students really enjoy, is that when you, for example, come to the section in Japji Sahib, which is talking about Sunan Man Nidyasan, right? The Suniye Podiyan, the Manan, Manne ki gat kehi na jaye, these Podiyan, and then with the Nidyasan. Now, if you don't know Japji Sahib, you have these sections which has multiple verses talking about the benefits of listening, the benefits of recognizing or accepting or kind of embodying, and then the benefits of continual practice. Nidhyasan means continually kind of, practicing this, whatever quality, devotion, cultivation of virtues, etc. Now, if you just read that by itself, you say, okay, that's cool. It's talking about the benefits of this. But if you just knew anything about Vedanta or Dvaita, for example, you wouldn't understand, like, okay, that's actually a key conceptual framework in Vedanta, right? Is it the exact same? Is the guru kind of appropriating that framework and then talking about it through a Sikh lens? This is what I'm going to be talking about. And you can only have those discussions if you first clearly outline, okay, what is the Advaita position or positions? Because that there's multiple different thoughts of schools of thought in that one school of Advaita. And then also how certain texts are like kind of plays off of old texts, right? When you see like Salahi Salati Surat Paiye, like these types of lines, like that Guru Nanak Dev Ji is talking about, you find very similar lines in some of the Upanishads as well. But what is the emphasis that Guru Nanak is giving when kind of talking about his line about all these rivers that merge within the ocean, right? His twist on it is that he's talking about Salahi Salah, he's talking about devotion, that through devotion, one, the rivers merge with the ocean, right? Not through just alone knowledge. And that's really important because when we talk about very generally that people might say, oh, Sikhi is just, a modern version of Vedanta. Do they even understand what Vedanta is? Do they even understand the multiple philosophical schools within that tradition? And you have to really read these side by side. They are in discussion with each other. Guru Nanak is, in discussion with these other schools, be it Vedanta, be it the yogis, be it other devotional Vaishnava schools, etc. Right? Like these are conversations taking place, right? Sufis as well. And the course, and this is kind of through my background in academia, doing a PhD, one thing that was really stressed in this PhD was to read across traditions, right? And that by reading across tradition, you get a much deeper sense of what a specific tradition is saying, because if you're looking at a certain time period, largely these traditions are in conversation with each other, right? And absolutely, there's a lot of commonality, but at the same time, there are disagreements and there are unique points among certain traditions, right? But you only get that sense if you're looking broadly. Sampradayas, at their best, do this when they, for example, have a set of preliminary readings like Sar Kotavali, Vairag Shatak, Kashadri, these types of texts are then kind of presenting, number one, how certain conceptual frameworks work, how certain terms are being used in these types of texts. But at the same time, like Vairag Shatak presents a very, let's say, a perspective of renunciation, right? Does that fully, is that fully congruent with Gurbani? You know, Personally, I would say they are at odds, right? At the same time, Gurbani does talk about Vairag, right? It's just how it does it is different, right? So you need to know how, for example, renunciation or say ascetic traditions talk about Vairag, and then you can understand how Guru Nanak Dev Ji is talking about Vairag, right? That you can actually have that uh, perspective of Virag or detachment, let's say renunciation, while living in the world, right? And this is what's very unique about Guru Nanak's perspective, that he's not saying renunciation is useless, right? There is that perspective, but it's positioned within living, in society with family and cultivating that, right? So he's holding those two at the same time. Um, and so, yeah, these are just some aspects of what the course will be kind of diving into.
For anyone who wants to dive deeper, And obviously, over the 2 episodes that we've done in relation to your Japji Sahib module in the wider StudySikhi course, where can they sign up for it? How do they get started? When does it begin? And is there anything else, obviously, that they need to know in preparation for the course? And also, I guess briefly, what is the format going to be like? Will it be similar to the module before? Is it similar to kind of a university module that you may have done? I guess giving people listening an idea of what to expect.
Yeah, so you don't need to know Gurmukhi. I will be presenting kind of transliteration. I'll have the kind of romanized script of the Gurbani there as well on the slides. So you don't need to, even if you've never read Japji Sahib, this course will be, helpful. It will be a great introduction. We are not going into like a PhD level depth into this one composition. Easily you could. This is just a kind of a more basic entry into the text, going line by line, extracting the kind of key conceptual kind of frameworks within the composition. But it will be applicable to those people who have never read it and who read it every day. I guarantee you, to that entire audience, they will find benefit from it. The format of the course is similar to, it was the exact same as SS 101, which was there's going to be pre-recorded, 90 minutes to 120-minute lectures. There's going to be 6 of those. They're going to launch, this one's going to launch August 17th, the first one. And then you will have a week to watch it. So there's a lecture, it'll be up for a week. You watch it, do the reading. The reading is largely going to be different interpretations of those verses that we're going to be covering, or it'll be context to those verses. For example, if a commentary talks about where Guru Nanak was, who he was talking to in relation, what were the questions posed, etc. So there won't be as many readings if you've done 101 compared to that, because we'll mainly just be reading through these verses, right? So you'll have a week to watch the lecture, and then on the weekend following when the lecture gets launched, we will be meeting together to discuss your questions. And also I will have exercises. I will be comparing different verses and asking the students to kind of speak about their thoughts about how, the different verses kind of resonated with them, what they thought about them as well. So there's both a recorded lecture and there's also a live session as well, where we will be kind of discussing for 90 minutes over Zoom. And if you want to look at the syllabus, if you want to look at what each module will be looking at, you can go to StudySikhi.com. And you will also find information about registration there if you're so interested. And I'm looking forward to having everybody there. The numbers have been just incredible so far. I'm really blessed that we have such a dedicated team here, that we're all kind of doing this journey together. I mean, this is the first time I've kind of collectively looked at all these different commentaries together, and I'm just having a blast going through it. And I know everybody who kind of dives deep into this work is also going to really enjoy it as well.
Just while you were talking, I was just writing an intro for this module, for this episode. So, pardon me on that one. Okay, no, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure and an honor to host you and have these discussions. I always feel like I get like a behind the scenes almost view of things. And obviously very excited to get my teeth into this as well. And obviously your first module, which I haven't had a chance yet to do. I can only implore people listening to go and sign up. However much it is, it's worth every penny. So yeah, I implore everyone to go and sign up. If you already have, tell your friends and family. And if you haven't, obviously, please do. But no, thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I loved it.
All right, so we have made it to the end of a 2-part episode podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Obviously, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if there are any other topics you would like us to cover, please let us know. I hope you really enjoyed it. And if you haven't, and you want to find out more, go and sign up to Jawala's StudySikhi.com course, where you can then sign up to module 2, which is the Japji Sahib course, and you will be able to find out way more than we've discussed. We've tried to pack in as much as possible. Otherwise than that, please make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. If you want to support me further, you can obviously do so by becoming a paid YouTube member or becoming a Patreon member, and all the links are below in the comments. Other than that, I hope you have a great time, and I'll see you in the next one.